I was really grateful to make it here with like all my body parts intact. On Route 90, there was some really severe accidents, one of which involved some sort of vegetable truck. So there was literally bulldozers like cleaning onions off of the highway in order for us to get by. So I'm glad to be here, and thank you all too for braving and dealing with whatever you had to do to get here. So I'm just curious, we have a lot of folks in the room. I don't know most of you. So I'm curious, how many folks here are farmers? Wow, right on. All right. How many folks here are policymakers or sort of hold that policy realm, try to keep the laws in order? Okay, awesome. Community-based activists? People who eat food? Awesome. Who else might leave it out? Oh, students? Okay. Artists? Beautiful. All right, what other category do you strongly identify with that I've not said? Educators. Right on. Oh, this is going to be exciting. So we're going to spend probably the first like 45, 50 minutes of what we're doing, going through some storytelling about how and why the food system is super racist and how it got to be that way and what we're trying to do about it, how that builds off the legacy of our ancestors. And then we'll spend the last 20, 25 minutes or so giving you a chance to talk with each other about what we're going to do about that, following the lead of the folks impacted by racism in the food system, if that sounds good to you. But first, of course, we need to acknowledge the Mother Earth herself, who is the source of all lands and water and sustenance and wisdom. So we want to shout out the Earth Mother. And we also want to shout out the First Nations people who have stewarded this land for 10,000 plus years. In my community, that's the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican folks. So I'm always holding them present in my heart, and many of them are very close relationship with whenever I'm doing stuff on my land, because that's not really my land. I am Black and Indigenous, but I'm not from that exact area. And my understanding is that we are on stolen land of the Narragansett and Wampanoag people. And so it's important to name that, but it's also important to think about what are we all doing about that, right? And so making sure that we're connected to Native sovereignty initiatives and supporting them with our resources, showing up for the protests, giving back lands if we have lands is very important to do as well. Wouldn't you agree? Yes. And also just want to shout out my team. I think we can have this dangerous trend, in a society so focused on individualism to even in the left to be colonized with the idea of celebrity activism. And so there must be one person whose idea it is, or one person holding the whole vision. And of course, that's never the case. So this is my squad, this is my team. We are farmers, we're educators, we're the people who build and fix the fences and the houses and, write reports and all that kind of stuff. So I just want to shout out and bring my team here present as well. So my mother is from Haiti, from Haiti, the island of Hispaniola, and there, anytime you're about to embark on a story, there's a call and response that we do. Any Haitians in the house? Yes. Do you know what it is? Okay, so the storyteller says creek, and then everyone who wants to hear the story says crack. So creek, crack, creek, crack. Beautiful. This is a tough story, but it has to do with the fact that the food system is not really broken. Right? It was designed to concentrate power and resource in the hands of a few people, and it's doing that very, very well. Right? And the food system, its DNA is stolen land and stolen labor. And that's something that is part of the origin story of our food system here in the United States of America, and it continues to be that blueprint for how the food system works. So we're going to sort of march through history and understand why that's my thesis that I'm presenting to you and how we can all engage with it. But it starts here. It starts with the original sin of our nation. Anyone know what this image represents? Manifest destiny, exactly. Which is? Like, that's it. I passed the quiz in history. That's all. Yeah, so manifest destiny is actually, it's a philosophy, right? It's that God gave the right to Europeans to go ahead and colonize the land, sea to shining sea. That this continent was sort of destined to be under European control. And this idea is actually older. This is an 1800s painting, but this idea is much older than that. It started in 1455 with Pope Nicholas of the Catholic Church, who came up with a papal decree called Doctrine of Discovery, which essentially said white Christian nations go forth, enslave, colonize, and pillage non-Christian, non-white nations. It was the beginning of the Age of Discovery. It's, Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, all that stuff came out of this decree. In 1823, the United States Supreme Court upheld the doctrine of discovery in the McIntosh case and baked it into U.S. law. That's when Native folks, the treaties were basically abandoned, and Native folks were told, you are domestic dependent nations. Once a white European nation plants their flag on your land, it's not your land anymore. You have the right to occupy it under certain conditions, but you don't have sovereignty anymore. The Supreme Court upheld that same doctrine many, many times throughout history. Most recently in 2005, in my very own state of New York, the Oneida Nation sued the county to get some of their lands back, and they were told, I'm sorry, doctrine of discovery, domestic dependent nation. So this is not old history, right? We still are on stolen land. We still haven't really reckoned with that. We haven't given the land back. So most of our food, of course, is grown on the land, and so we have to be considering that very carefully anytime we talk about the food system. And I'll just point out here too that, when I first started in this work, I thought about ending hunger pretty narrowly. I was just like, how do you get the food into people's mouths without really contextualizing food sovereignty? So it's not just about the access to the food, but who has power, who has control, who's calling the shots, what does long-term security look like? And so that's the frame that we'll be taking as like a little broader view on the food system, because it's one thing to have plenty of food pantries around. It's a completely other thing for people to own their own land and their own businesses and their own farms and be producing food in their own, processing facilities and so on, and really, really, truly have agency and power and control. So stolen land, stolen labor, DNA of the U.S. food system. Anyone know what this picture represents? You do know. Thank you. So this represents the enslavement of 12.5 million African people, most of whom were very skilled agriculturalists. I will say that I, at first, had bought that myth that my ancestors were rounded up just because they were strong or something. But it turns out, and scholars are confirming this, you can check out the book Black Rice is one of them, there's a few others. But Europeans, what climate were they living in and farming in the 14, 15, 1600s? Temperate, right. What's it like in Georgia, Florida, Cuba, Brazil? Totally different climate. And so the slavers would intentionally round up very skilled farmers who would set up the systems on these plantations. The Carolina rice system, rice doesn't grow in England, right? And so all of these systems were really created by skilled agriculturalists. So there was a double loss, like obviously the suffering, unimaginable suffering experienced by our ancestors in the transatlantic slave trade and having their families ripped apart, all of that. But also think about the deprivation on the continent when the very best farmers were kidnapped, right, and taken away. So this built the wealth of our nation, trillions and trillions of dollars of wealth, which continues to be passed down in Goldman Sachs and so on and so forth. But we're all good with that, right? No more slavery anymore, stolen land, we don't have to worry about that anymore. Like, great. So 1865, what happened? Very important year for Black Americans in particular. End of the Civil War. 13th Amendment. Right? Emancipation Proclamation said no more slavery except in the case of a certain exception clause. Yes, if you are convicted of a crime, you can be forced to work for no money. We're seeing this right now in California with the fires, right? Unpaid prison labor who are putting out fires and often at great risk to their health and their lives. And this was part of the compromise at the end of the Civil War. So what happened with this is because in the South there was such fear amongst the plantation owners about the undermining of their economic base. They exploited this exception clause by creating a whole new set of laws called the Black Codes. For the first time you see on the books things like vagrancy, that means not having a job, that was a crime. Loitering means standing around, that became a crime. Right? Being not industrious and honest was a crime that would get your children taken away and apprenticed back to their former masters. And once you were incarcerated for these crimes, and the prisons filled, they were 96% black in 1866. Before there was almost no black people in prison. And it wasn't rape and murder. It was vagrancy and loitering and maybe stealing your neighbor's pig or not. People were then leased back to the plantation, and the state kept the money. They were also leased to the railroads and to the mines. In the late 1860s, Alabama state budget, their income was 73% conflict leasing. So this wasn't a side note on history. This was a substantial source of income for states in the South. And of course, you know, if you're renting something, you don't even have the same incentive as if you own it to keep it alive. And so the death tolls were very extreme under this system. Black folks who weren't incarcerated were mostly sharecropping or tenant farming. So that's when you stay on the plantation and then you pay the landowner for your seed, your house, your fertilizer, your hogs, your clothing, all of these things. It's a debt peonage system because you get into a worse situation year after year. Because you're under contract, you can't leave on pain of death. So we didn't really, even after slavery ended, we didn't reckon as a nation with how are we going to get our food, how are we going to get our agricultural products without exploiting people and exploiting the land. This continued. People are sharecropping up until the 1950s. But it started to die down a little bit in the early between 1910 and 1920. Because what was happening, which is so astounding to me, that our ancestors were just really incredible. Because you just think how busy you would be trying to make your ends meet as a sharecropper. And they would take their Sundays and then go and do extra work on someone else's land. So maybe they would, you know, go make shoes or be carpenters and so on. And they saved that Sunday money and purchased 16 million acres of land by 1910, which was 14% of the nation's farmland. And the plantation owners were freaking out again. This was the next big freak out. Because what are you going to do without your sharecroppers? I mean, if all these black folks suddenly have their own farms and their own land and they're feeding themselves, it's like, how are they going to run their plantations? Right? So this was the peak of racial terrorism in the South until the 1960s, when it had a big resurgence. Ku Klux Klan, later the White Citizens Council, and a lot of these people under their hoods. This was like the mayor, you know, the chief of police, and all that stuff. So it was pretty aligned with government. But what they were doing is they were particularly targeting landowners. 4,500 lynchings happened in the South. The majority of them were targeting people who were either owning land or trying to own land. And just to give you an example of what this is actually like, because 4,500 is a number, but these are people, I'm going to tell you about one person, okay, by reading a quote to you from a recent study by the Associated Press. After midnight, on October 4th, 1908, 50 hooded white men surrounded the home of a black farmer in Hickman, Kentucky, and ordered him to come out for a whipping. When David Walker refused and shot at them instead, the mob poured coal oil on his house and set it afire, according to contemporary newspaper accounts. Pleading for mercy, Walker ran out the front door, followed by 4 screaming children and his wife carrying a baby in her arms. The mob shot them all, wounding 3 children and killing the others. Walker's oldest son never escaped the burning house. No one was ever charged with the killings, and the surviving children were deprived of the farm their father died defending. Land records show that Walker's 2.5-acre farm was simply folded into the property of a white neighbor. The neighbor sold it to another man whose daughter owns the undeveloped land today. Just want to sit with that for a minute, you know, because this was the twice land theft. Right? There was the original theft from the indigenous people, and then there was another theft from black people. Right now, there's almost no black land left, less than 1% of the land. And it was a lot of this. It was also some governmental discrimination that got into the mix. But what happened was, you know, a lot of times we think of the Great Migration, which was the largest internal migration in the history of this country, 6 million black people moving north. As just that, like seeking opportunity, this is like factory jobs. And while there certainly are pull factors in any migration, there's also, for those of us who took U.S. history, there's push factors, right? And it was, in many ways, a refugee crisis. Because it was not safe to stay in the South and try to have any modicum of independence. You'd be targeted, you know, by these folks. So there was a labor vacuum. You know, people left the South. And in an attempt to fill that, rather than the U.S. having that reckoning moment of saying, now we need to pay a fair wage, you know, for our farm workers, it came up with a new strategy. Right? This is now 1930s. We have very important legislation coming around for workers in the United States. Anyone know what happened? FDR in the 30s. Social Security, minimum wage, maximum number of hours you can work in a week, overtime pay, child labor protections. I mean, this was revolutionary. And to FDR's credit, originally this was supposed to benefit all workers in the United States, but the Southern Democrats, and the Democrats and Republicans were flipped back then, you know, it changed. The Southern Democrats would not vote for it if it benefited any black and brown people. And you can FOIA this, you can look, it's literally the transcripts of those conversations. So they made an exception, they made a compromise. They said, we'll pass these laws, but you have to put a clause that if you're an agricultural worker or a domestic worker, you do not get these benefits. Because the agricultural workers and the domestic workers were black and brown and Latinx by this point. And what's astounding about this, you know, a generation later, Social Security was given to everybody. But still today, if you look at the Fair Labor Standards Act and the Labor Relations Act, there are the same exception clauses. So if you work in a kitchen or you work in the field, you make less money. And if you work in the field and you work on a farm with less than 7 people, you don't even have a minimum wage, federally. Your state might, but federally you have no minimum wage. Children as young as 12 don't have to go to school, they can just work in the fields. You know, the farmers in Vermont, near where I live, don't have the right to a day off in 7, and so they're on these shifts where they get 2 hours of sleep, and then they go back to milking. Like, this is today. This is what's happening today, because our federal laws actually do not protect the people who grow our food, which, by the way, 85% of the people who grow our food are Latinx people, right? So we have this program that started to fill the labor vacuum, right? It used to be called the Bracero program. It was replaced with H2, then H2A, but this is the guest worker program. This is basically, it sounds a little bit cynical, but I don't think it's an exaggeration, is creating an international trade situation so dire that people need to leave their homeland and families to come do underpaid work that's dangerous and degrading. Okay. The average lifespan, so people when they arrive to the United States as farm workers are healthier on average than their contemporaries. But the average lifespan of a farm worker, the average age of that is 49 years old in this country because of those conditions. This is just, I just saw this Pew Research Center came up with this. And so, you know, the pesticide exposures, the heat exposure, the long days, the being away from your family, being outside of your cultural context, dealing with wage theft, harassment, all of these things that folks deal with when they come here. And maybe I'll just do this experiment on y'all, because a friend of mine asked, he's a professor at an ag university out in the Midwest, and he was talking to a class of all people who wanted to be farmers, and he asked them this question. He said, how much would you need to be paid per hour to work at the meat packing plant down the road? And so I'll tell you what they said, but I'm curious what you would say. Imagine a meat packing plant, 3,000 hogs an hour, it's right down the road. How much you need to be paid to go work there? Quit your job, put on the apron, you know, do the nice thing all day.
Not gonna happen.
30? You're like, I'll work there for 2 now. Did a job. Okay. Anyone else? What is the no? So that's exactly what 100% of his class said. I would not do that job for any amount of money. Right? And that's something for us to think about. That we create a food system that the only way that people want to work in it is if they have no other choice. Because we've created a system of desperation. And that's a food that we eat oftentimes without thinking about it, you know? What does that have to say about the morality that's baked in, or the lack of morality that's sort of baked into the system that we have? Because you're right, I wouldn't work there either for any amount of money. I would have to have no other option. My child is starving, and that's my only option. So at the same time as farm workers from Mexico, from Central America, you know, are coming in to take the place of black sharecroppers on the farm, land-owning black farmers are losing their land. And we talked a little bit about the racial terrorism, which certainly was one of the push factors. Perhaps more importantly in terms of numbers was governmental discrimination. For those who don't know, agriculture is a highly subsidized industry. So the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture has got their farm bill. It's a $9 billion piece of legislation. It provides food stamps, aka SNAP. It provides crop insurance, crop allotments, grants, farmer training, loans, environmental conservation. It does a whole package of programs. Almost every farmer, you know, farmers have the right to access these programs, and the industry would really come to a halt without it. So it's good to give a little context there. But what happened is because the USDA distributes all these resources at the county level, and the county committees are elected by the local farmers, a lot of the racism in the South sort of entered and